Bonjour. Hello. My name is Dr. Scott Sochay. I am a member of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. Our tribe resides mainly in the northern part of the lower peninsula of Michigan and the southern part of the upper peninsula of Michigan. Since 1999, I have been a professor at Bethel University, and my area of specialty is in the media. I teach everything from media law to media theory, media effects, media technology, writing for the media, and a host of other courses. I am also blessed at Bethel to be able to teach two courses directly related to my native heritage. I teach a course on, it's called the Freshman Inquiry course, and students there learn how to give speeches and how to write papers for college. And my course is entitled Exploring Native Cultures, and that's the content or the subject matter for which they do the speeches and the papers for that particular course. So I get to share my culture there, and students then have to learn how to share a native culture with their classmates through speeches and papers. Then I also teach a course on Native Americans in the media, where we explore how movies and television and the internet and even music and newspapers portray Native Americans, what stereotypes arise or develop out of that. And then we also look at how natives choose to portray themselves. So I get several ways in which I can express or share my culture in the Bethel community. And I've really come to value that and appreciate that. And I love having that opportunity to share my culture with others, such as having the opportunity here to share my culture with you today. Well, given that, let's just look at a few statistics first off. That there are over 500 federally recognized tribes here in the United States today, of which there are more than 200 distinct languages spoken, and natives live on a little bit more than 300 federally recognized reservations. Another important demographic trend is that less than 50% of Native Americans today are of full blood and grew up on their reservation. These statistics have several implications that have affected me over my life. First is that when most people find out that I'm Native, they assume that there really is just one Native culture. That's it. All Native Americans are the same. And so I usually typically have to try and dispel that notion and say, no, we are distinct cultures, distinct languages, distinct rituals and ceremonies and ways of life. And I often use the analogy, it's kind of like Europe. On the continent of Europe, we don't expect just one European culture. The French culture is distinct from the German culture, which is distinct from the Italian culture, which is distinct from the Spanish culture. Same thing here in North America, that native cultures are distinct, and that's usually one of the first stereotypes that I have to overcome when I talk with others about my native heritage. The other is the idea that because of the demographics, less than 50% now of all natives are full-blooded or live on or grew up on the reservation, is that more and more Native Americans are just like me. Less than full blood, didn't grow up on the reservation, and one of the key questions that I have had to ask throughout my life, and I think maybe suspect that some of you might be asking even now, is the question, what does it mean to be Native? And I'm going to share a little bit about my journey in terms of how I answer that question and talk about my family and my ancestors here. But I encourage you, if you've not really explored the question, what does it mean to be Native? because maybe you haven't had exposure to your tribe to a great extent, uh, answer that question. And there's nothing that says you have to do it now. And let me illustrate from my own family, for example. I'm the oldest of 8 kids, and 4 of us in our family have chosen to deeply explore that question: what does it mean to be Native? The other 4, not so much, and that's fine. It is up to you as an individual to decide if and when, how you might want to explore answering that question: what does it mean to be Native? Well, in Western culture, we typically introduce ourselves by who we are and what we've done and what our position is and so on. And I've done a little bit of that already. But in my tribe's culture, we introduce ourselves a different way. We introduce ourselves by who we are in relationship to our ancestors, because that's an important part of who we are. We are not just individuals, we are also a member of a family, a clan, a tribe, and we are human beings as part of a larger culture. So I'll start my story by talking about my grandmother Elizabeth, because she was really the heart and soul of Native culture that I grew up learning when I was young. And I'll hold up a picture. This is my grandmother Elizabeth, and that is my father Cornelius there with her. So that's her when she was a little bit younger. And then here is a picture of mostly how I remember her when, as my grandmother, a little bit older, and she was the one who primarily taught me about my Native culture. She was the one who taught me some of my first words in our tribal language. She was the one who told the stories of the tribe. She was also known as a wonderful, tremendous artist in the Native community. And I'll just go ahead and hold up some of her work. For example, she was known for wood burning and then painting her wood burning. And this is part of her set on one of her sets that she did. We have some of these at our family camp up in the Upper Peninsula, so I always get to see her artwork, and that reminds me of her every time we go back to the Upper Peninsula. But the story of this is actually kind of fun, in that about 2 years ago, I was in a thrift store in the Upper Peninsula, and I saw these 2 pictures hanging on the wall. And I knew exactly what they were as soon as I saw them on the wall. And I literally started crying as I pulled them off the wall because I was going to buy them. These were meant definitely for me. Well, my twin brother had been outside making a phone call, and so he walked into the thrift store. He saw me holding them, and he said, "Are those what I think they are?" Yeah, they are. And so I brought them up to the register with tears in my eyes and bought them, and they are just a family treasure. For me to have something that my grandmother made and to find it in a thrift store, that was just such a blessing. All right, well, and I'm a little bit teary-eyed right now just thinking about that experience from a couple of years ago, to encounter my grandmother in a way that I hadn't anticipated. Well, like I said, my grandmother Elizabeth was the really the matriarch of our family, the one who kept my Native heritage in front of me, because I grew up in a biracial household. My dad Native, my mom white. And so I always knew I was Native growing up, but I really didn't quite understand what that meant to any great extent. And a lot of that was colored by my grandmother's and my dad's life experiences. My grandmother, when she was in her early 20s, convinced her parents to allow her and a friend of hers to leave the reservation and make a trip to the big city of Milwaukee. And it was the first time she had ever really left the reservation. Her ability to speak English was somewhat limited, her friend a little bit better in terms of that. And while they were exploring Milwaukee, she met this tailor by trade, this gentleman by the name of Stanley Sochay. And here is a picture of Stanley. And this is Stanley with my dad, Cornelius, in the house they lived in on my tribe's land. Well, sparks flew. Elizabeth and Stanley hit it off. And after Elizabeth went back to the reservation, they corresponded by letter. And eventually, Stanley proposed and Elizabeth accepted. And then Stanley did something that was very progressive, I guess. in that period of time. Rather than having Elizabeth leave our tribal land and go to live with him in Milwaukee, because he was a tailor, he went ahead and moved on to our tribe's land and started his business there. And so he moved onto the reservation so that Elizabeth could still, in a sense, be comfortable in the people around her and the culture and the lifestyle that she lived. And so that was pretty bold of Stanley in those days. However, one of the things that Stanley insisted upon is that Cornelius, their one and only son, my father, get an education. In my tribe, education was not valued at that time, and to a great extent, it is still not valued today, which is, I think, one of the negatives of my tribe today. And so Stanley, insisting that my dad get an education, would join with his classmates. They had to, our tribe's land was right next door to a white town, a town by the name of Nama. And Nama was a white community built on logging and foresting and so on. And they had an elementary and a junior high and a high school there. And up until third grade, pretty much all of the kids in the tribe would leave our tribe's reservation, cross over a bridge because the river separated the two towns, cross over the bridge, go into Nama, and get their education there in the American school system. And through third grade, all of them did. But after third grade, most of the family says that's enough education for our kids, and they no longer went to the schools in Nama. But my grandfather Stanley insisted that my dad Cornelius continue on with his education. And he ultimately went not only from third grade and up, he graduated from high school through Nama. And my dad didn't like to talk a lot about some of those experiences. My dad passed away back in 2011 from cancer. And when we knew the end was getting a little bit near, I took one day just to spend hours with him and said, Dad, tell me stories about what it was like growing up. Tell me stories about what it was like to meet my mom for the first time and so on. And really for the first time in his life, I think he realized that it was important to share those stories, and he decided to open up. And one of the stories he told that really stuck with me is that he would tell about how when he would cross the bridge from my tribe's land into the town of Nama, that was fine. But when he was done with the school day and came back to the tribe, he said he would build up a head of steam and run across the bridge as fast as he could because his Indian friends would taunt him for continuing to go on to the white school after third grade. And so in a sense, they often tried to shame him for my dad's insistence that he continue on with his education. And that affected my dad fairly profoundly. Even more so that by the time he got into high school, about 16 years old, one of the times when he crossed the bridge and came back onto the tribal land, he got home and heard the terrible news that Stanley had drowned. And to my dad's dying day, he never thought it was an accident. My grandfather Stanley was never widely accepted by the tribe for having the audacity to marry one of the women of their tribe and then move on to the reservation. And so my dad grew up seeing Stanley somewhat mistreated by the members of my tribe, especially the males. And he thought to his dying day that Stanley didn't drown, but that he was murdered. And because of that, that started my dad on the path of rejecting his native heritage. And one of the ways that he escaped, in a sense, from the tribe was that when he graduated from high school, my dad was a phenomenal athlete. He was good in a wide variety of sports: football, baseball, basketball, track and field. And at one point, he was even offered an opportunity to play minor league baseball. Eventually turned it down to start his career and get married and raise a family. But he became part of the very first athletic scholarship class at Northern Michigan University in the 1950s. And I wear this shirt right now to honor him because he had the opportunity then to go to college and have it paid for, which in those days, in my tribe, there was no money for a college education. And yet through his athletic skills, he got a full ride to Northern Michigan University and eventually graduated from there with his business degree. And so while he was at Northern then, that's where he met my mother. And that's eventually where I and my identical twin brother were the first members of our family. And like I said, I'm the oldest of 8, so many more came down the road. But my dad used Northern Michigan as his way to, in a sense, get away from the tribe and establish his own identity. And then as he married and had kids, he decided that he wasn't all that interested in passing on his native heritage directly to his kids. So my dad never told me stories, never shared the language, even though he spoke it. Never, for example, had any of us as his children go through any naming ceremonies or anything like that to connect with the tribe. So most everything I got in terms of what it meant to be native came from the time when I would visit my grandmother, which was now in retrospect, not as often as I would have liked it, but she really was my connection to the tribe to help me realize that no matter what was happening around me as I was growing up, I was Indian. And she helped me understand that. My grandmother eventually passed away in 1984, about the time that I was in high school, kind of that age, in college, that age range. And so she had been my lifeline all up until then. So my dad, not wanting to pass on his heritage to his kids, was really confusing to me growing up because I could see my dad's skin, which was very red. It very much contrasted with my mom's very fair, light-colored skin. And in the 1960s, when I was growing up, and into the 1970s, biracial couples in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan weren't all that accepted. So I saw my dad harassed just because of the color of his skin on a regular basis as I was growing up. So in that sense, the first experience I had, really, besides my grandmother's connection to my tribe, was, in a sense, people looking down upon Native Americans. And it was almost a sense of shame and of guilt that you had to be guilty if you were a Native American. And it also meant that I had trouble understanding my dad because my dad, even though he, in a sense, turned away from his Native American heritage, he couldn't help living the way he had been brought up. He grew up in the Native American culture. He grew up seeing the world the way that Native Americans, the way that our tribe saw the world. He had Native values, and he did things on a daily basis that reflected who he was as an Indian. And so I would see him and hear him and watch him, and he was doing things the Native way, but not explaining why it was the Native way and how it differed from the American way or the Western culture way. So in that sense, it was very confusing growing up, and I'll share one way to illustrate that. In that my twin brother and I were athletic, not nearly as athletic as my father, but we then often had to get to and from sports practices, and my dad was the one who usually did that. And sometimes he would drop us off at practice 2 hours before practice was supposed to start. Sometimes he would not pick us up till an hour after it was over. And there were some occasions where he would even come in the middle of practice and say it was time to go home now. And for my twin brother and I, that was always very confusing, and that my dad seemed to have a pretty kind of warped sense of time. And it wasn't until when I get a little bit later here in my story, as I started to learn how Native Americans see the world, how my tribe saw the world, it was then I realized, only then, that my tribe saw the world through place rather than time. And so Native concepts of time differ from Western concepts of time. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on that when I get a bit further in my story. So it meant then that I was confused about basic things like that. How do you live, or how do you view daily life? And so I really didn't get a whole lot of that from my father as I was growing up. Now, my dad, unfortunately, like far too many Native American men, was an alcoholic for most of my time growing up. There is a much more positive end of the story in that later on in life, about the last decade or so of his life, He was able to beat alcoholism and uh, become someone who was a much more relatable person, someone who I could finally, in a sense, reconnect with. So I really value that last decade of his life. So if any of you are going through struggles like that, where there might be addiction in your family, and again, it tends to run prevalent among the males more so than females, that there is hope, that alcoholism and addictions like that can be overcome. And my dad is a testament to that. It took a long time, but he overcame it, and that led to a restored relationship between me and my father. Well, as I got older, then went through elementary and junior high and high school and so on, it came closer and closer to the time to think about going on to college. I had my dad's example of going on to college, so my dad actually valued his education, and it became then the question: how am I going to pay for this? As the oldest of 8 with an alcoholic father, there was no help coming from my family to help pay for my education. I was pretty much on my own to figure out how to get through school. And so as I started doing some research and trying to figure out how can I pay for college, are there scholarships available, things of that nature, one of the things I came across was this thing in the state of Michigan called the 1971 Native American Tuition Waiver Act. I said, oh, well, that sounds pretty good. Tuition waiver. What does that mean? And I started then to learn something about more of my heritage by digging into this scholarship and its origins. And what I learned there is that in the 1960s, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others were leading the civil rights movement, Native Americans kind of felt left out, that this is kind of a black and white thing. Where do we fit in terms of civil rights? And so organizations like the American Indian Movement, which was founded right here in Minneapolis, started, in a sense, a Native American civil rights movement. And one of the things that they did is they tried to work with the state and federal government in terms of educating them about the history of treaties. Because as it turns out, every treaty that the federal government ever signed with Native tribes, the federal government broke. Every single one of them. And that included the treaty that involved my tribe. Back in 1836 and 1855, treaties were signed with my tribe and surrounding tribes in Michigan, where we ceded over much of our land. And one of the things we were promised in return for our land were educational resources in perpetuity. What does that mean? Is that the state and federal governments had promised to help the tribes in Michigan with education forever, of which they promptly did absolutely nothing. And so in the early 1970s, as Native American activists were working with state and federal governments and educating them about some of these broken treaty promises, it prompted the state of Michigan to pass the 1971 Native American Tuition Waiver Act. And what that act said is, as long as you had a direct blood relative on the 1908 census of natives living within the state of Michigan, you were guaranteed free tuition at any public college or university in the state of Michigan. And that included not just your undergrad, but also graduate school as well. So that sounded really exciting. And so now I had to figure out, do I have relatives on that 1908 census roll that would make me eligible for the 1971 Native American Tuition Waiver Act? So I had to go to the state of Michigan library where they kept, it was called the Durant Roll, where they kept that census. And pretty soon I realized this was not going to be a simple task, because the census roll was in no particular order whatsoever. You just had to put this thing called microfiche into a microfiche reader and scroll through it and scan through it and try and find the names of your direct blood relatives. And in 1908, I knew that would be not my grandmother, Elizabeth, but most likely it would be my great-grandparents. Because in 1908, my grandmother Elizabeth was all of 2 years old, so whether or not she would have shown up on the roll or not, I didn't know. But I had the name of my great-grandparents, and after hours of searching through the microfiche, I finally found them. There were my great-grandparents, and my grandmother Elizabeth was on the roll at the age of 2. And so I qualified for the Native American tuition waiver. That meant then that I did my undergrad at Michigan State University tuition free for all 4 years of my time at Michigan State. And this became, in a sense, one of those turning points in my life where I said, I've grown up knowing all my life that I was Native, but I had never really had much of an opportunity to explore it because my dad didn't really want to explore it. And I had infrequent contact with my grandmother and almost no contact whatsoever with my tribe. But I made a vow that said, because my Native heritage is paying for my college education, I am going to seriously explore what it means to be Native. And one of the blessings at Michigan State is they had an organization called the North American Indian Student Organization, NASO, which was specifically put together or formed to help Native students better connect with their Native culture. The organization would bring in elders to speak and share stories, and they would sponsor an annual powwow and so on. So for me, it was the first time, in a sense, to get a little bit more immersed in what it meant to be Native. And I heard stories, some stories that were new and some that I had heard from my grandmother years ago. And it really was an awakening time for me. And as I started to be a part of NASO and learn more about my heritage and participate in powwows, I started to better understand the way Native Americans view the world, the way my tribe saw the world. And that was, like I said, life changing in the sense that I finally now started to understand my dad, why he did things the way he did, why he lived the way he did, why he saw the world the way that he did. And so that was something I hadn't anticipated at all coming out of that experience, but it was pretty amazing. And really, from that point on, from college, the quest to understand what it means to be Native has been a very significant part of my life. And I would say, today and for quite some time, I have far more identified as Native than I have as white as a result of starting that quest when I was in college. I don't want to put down my white heritage. That's still important and it's significant and it's who I am. But I have been far more Native because I realized that I actually grew up learning to see the world through Native eyes. I just didn't know I was growing up seeing the world through Native eyes. And so, in many respects, then, it was that college journey, that eligibility for that scholarship that really triggered that. And at some point in your life, if you've never really seriously explored what it means to be Native, I hope you have that triggering point that would start you on that path of trying to connect with your tribe and your heritage and your culture and your stories. Well, while I was in college then, I was thinking about three areas of potential study. I was thinking about going into the media, I was thinking about going into education, and I was thinking about going into law. All three of those were really near and dear to my heart. And so as I graduated from Michigan State with my bachelor's, my master's degree was paid for by the Native American tuition waiver. And then after my master's, I decided to go on to my PhD, and that was also at Michigan State, again paid for by the Native American tuition waiver. And so really, I would not be a professor at Bethel University today. And I've been now at Bethel. This is my 21st year, and before that, I spent 5 years teaching at the University of Pittsburgh at one of their regional campuses. I would not be a professor were it not for my Native heritage. I never would have been able to afford or pay for that. So if you're kind of wondering where resources might come to help you with your education, chances are they're out there. You just need to find them and seek out people at your school, especially when you get to high school. Seek out some of those ways where there might be resources available to help you further your education. And as I was doing that, several things stood out that as part of my professional career that I really am proud of in terms of being a Native, in that Michigan State was the first school to start a broadcast department, a broadcast program, a media program back in the 1950s. And by the time I started doing my PhD work at Michigan State there in the 1990s, Michigan State was considered the best PhD program in the country for media. it was the place you wanted to go if you wanted to study media. And so I was very humbled to be accepted into that program, but not only accepted into that program, but Michigan State nominated me for something called the Minority Competitive Doctoral Fellowship, which I did receive. It was a 2-year fellowship worth $25,000, which enabled me to not just, I already had the free tuition, but now I could actually have an apartment and a car and buy food and clothing and so on, so that I didn't really have to worry about trying to work while I was working on my PhD. And that was such a blessing to have that. And again, that's something that was connected to my native heritage. Oh, and I should mention, by the way, once my father learned that his children could get tuition waivers for college and so on, that was the spark that set him on the journey of reconnecting with our tribe and reconnecting with his native heritage and becoming proud of being native. So my little part in answering the question what it meant to be native helped my dad reconnect with the tribe. So that was another way that helped me restore or renew my relationship with my father. And that was unexpected as well, but again, such a blessing. So at Michigan State, again, I had additional resources, the Minority Competitive Doctoral Fellowship. And when I finally completed my PhD in 1998, I became the first Native American to receive a PhD in media from Michigan State ever. The program had started in the 50s, and here we are in 1998. And that says something about Native Americans in education, that there aren't too many of us who go on to get advanced degrees. That's still something out of the norm. So if you like school, and I hope you do, and eventually if it's placed within your heart or desires or interests to continue on with your education, we need more Native Americans in higher education. It's not an avenue that has been chosen very much by natives. Some of the more popular fields do tend to be law and medicine and education, not so much the media. In fact, in 1998, when I received my degree, there's an organization that tracks PhDs and race and ethnicity. And in 1998, I was the only Native American in the entire country to receive a PhD in media. And in 1997 and in 1999, the 2 years that bordered my degree, there were 0 Native Americans who received a PhD in media. So again, a very small subset of Native Americans go on to get those sorts of advanced degrees. So not only was I the first at Michigan State to be Native and receive a PhD, some of the other academic accomplishments that I'm really proud of in terms of being Native is that there's an organization called the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. It's an organization for those involved in media studies, for professors and so on. And I had the privilege of hosting the very first all-native panel in AEJMC's history. I'm already about a half an hour in here and starting to stumble a little bit. But that was a privilege to be the host of an all-native panel for the first time in a professional organization's history. And even at Bethel, some of the other things I'm proud of now is that when I started there in 1999, I became Bethel's only full-time faculty member who's a member of a federally recognized tribe. And unfortunately, still today, 21 years later, I'm still Bethel's only full-time faculty member who's a member of a federally recognized tribe. And I may very well be the first Native American faculty member in Bethel's history. No one has quite been able to verify that, but neither have they been able to find any Native American faculty members before I joined. And so one of the things that I really emphasize at Bethel is I really felt that part of the reason why I am at Bethel is to share my Native culture and heritage with the Bethel community. And I've done that I've done hundreds of guest lectures in various classes. I do special events and programming and serve on panels to talk about Native American issues. I help the Native American student group on campus, which is called First Nations. I'm their advisor. And eventually, a little over a year ago, Bethel honored all that service to the Bethel community by awarding me the Faculty Excellence Award for Service, which is granted once a year to faculty members, and it's kind of like the Oscars at Bethel to receive one of those awards. It's prestigious, and it kind of puts you in a sense at a different level at Bethel in terms of recognition from your peers and from the Bethel community. So I am very proud, and I love sharing my Native heritage now with others. And with that comes the idea of, in a sense, because at first glance I don't look particularly Native. Most people don't know I'm Indian until I tell them. And by the way, throughout this talk, I've used terms like Native American, Native Indian, and so on. That's a whole issue in and of itself. What do we call the indigenous peoples here of North America? In my tribe, for example, we're the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians, but when we refer to ourselves in the context of our tribe itself, it's Anishinaabe or Anishinaabe. You can pronounce it several different ways. And in our tribal language, that simply means we're the people or the people of this land. But if I use that descriptor to tell people who I am, I'm going to get blank stares. So usually I use a term like, oh yeah, I'm a Native American. But there are some within my tribe who absolutely hate that term, and for somewhat for good reason, because if someone was born in the United States, they can also claim to be a Native American. And the name American itself comes from Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian explorer. So some of the terms that we use just don't really fit, but they're part of the common convention that make it easy. So I often refer to myself as Native, but I would love to take that to a deeper level as I get to know people and relate to them. And I often have to grant grace as well, because oftentimes when people learn that I'm Native, one of their first responses is, oh, I saw Dances with Wolves, or I read Bury My Heart with Wounded Knee, or they ask, are you familiar with this particular book or whatever that may have been written by, say, someone from the Navajo tribe or whatever. And in a sense, that's almost asking someone, when you find out that they're from Europe, but they're actually German, and you start asking them about French culture. So there's grace and there's patience, and I love to fill that educational role to help people understand that Native cultures are very diverse and rich, and we're not all just one particular culture. And then my Native culture, as I've gone on that journey, and as I teach now at Bethel, I think one of the most significant things I've learned in that whole process is my culture helps inform and helps me understand how I understand God and how I view my relationship with God. And this, in many ways, is a very potentially difficult issue to address in Native American communities, because some of the first exposure that tribes had to missionaries or Christians or those bringing the gospel to the tribes, oftentimes that was not a positive experience, because many missionaries said that really Christianity is a better way than the way natives viewed God. So there was this sense of superiority. And they also said, not only do you need to convert to Christianity, but in doing so, you have to give up everything about what it means to be Indian. You have to give up your culture, your language, everything, because Christianity and Native culture have absolutely nothing in common. And that was a huge mistake on the part of missionaries, because Christians should realize that much of Western Christianity borrows from non-Christian sources, such as Christmas trees have pagan origins, Easter eggs have pagan origins, and yet Christians have no difficulty incorporating Easter eggs or Christmas trees into their holiday celebrations. And so that's one of the things that my Native heritage helps me realize is I don't have to give up being Native to have a relationship with God. And I can illustrate that in one sense with this right here. This is my eagle staff. And in my tribe's view of religion and of God, a eagle staff is something that helps us connect with God, to have a relationship and make sure we maintain a right relationship with God. The wood comes from the resources that God has given us. The eagle on the top of the eagle staff, the eagle head, is important because the eagle is especially sacred in my tribe because it flies the highest and thus is closest to the spirits and to our ancestors. And so the combination of the eagle and the wood for the staff says that these are indicators or reminders of how the Creator has blessed us and connected with us. And so I often use the eagle staff as a reminder when I pray that I need to be in right relationship with my fellow human beings, and I need to be in right relationship with the Creator. And for me, that's the God of the Bible. But my Native American heritage helps me understand God better in many ways, and I'll share a couple with respect to my Christianity. In that being Native helps me better understand God. For example, in Genesis, there's the creation story. It's 7 days of creation, and on each day God did something. The seventh day he rested. But when Western culture tends to look at the creation story in Genesis 1:1, they tend to view it a little bit more through the scientific, materialistic lens of Western culture. And they ask questions like, well, how long is a day? And how old is the earth? And, all these sorts of science or time related questions. But when I view Genesis through Native eyes, I see that the Genesis story is about relationships. God created this and said it was good. God made the moon and the stars and the plants and the animals and saw that they were good. So God is establishing right relationships in terms of creation, which then culminates in the creation of us as human beings. And so for me, Genesis is a relational story, not a scientific story. And in other ways, it also helps me contrast with Western worldviews where there are very divergent understandings of the relationship between governments and native tribes here in North America. For example, the United States and other countries felt that they could just take the land of North America under this concept of manifest destiny. It was the idea that America was the new Israel, the city set on a hill, and that just as God had given Israel, the land of Israel, the promised land, that God was somehow giving Americans the new world as a new promised land, a new Israel. And thus, just as in the Bible, God commanded Israel to take over the land from the peoples that were living there, the Amalekites and the Canaanites and so on. And that gave us stories like Joshua and the walls of Jericho. That just as Israel conquered the land, that America could conquer North America and displace the Indian tribes because it was God's destiny or manifest destiny that this land would belong to Americans and not to the Indigenous who lived here. On the other hand, my tribe says the exact opposite, that because of our creation stories, we believe that God gave us our land, that it was our promised land, it was our sacred land, and the land is important to us. I said earlier the name of our tribe, Anishinaabe, that translates to the people or the people of this land. And so we feel connected to the land, that the land is our promised land. So that's a very different viewpoint, that the Western perspective says that the land could be taken away from Native Americans. My tribal perspective says the land is sacred. And I want to view it more through that land, that this is our promised land, that our reservation land is our land. And that's what the Creator has given us. It also affects me in other ways. In Western Christianity, the idea of dreams and visions and so on are taken with a fair degree of skepticism. But my Native heritage says these are valid ways of connecting with God. And I want to connect with God in as many ways as I possibly can. And so I don't have to give up my culture to be a Christian. And that also was part of my journey in terms of trying to understand what it meant to be Indian, is that I can connect with the Creator, I can connect with God without having to give up who I am as a Native American. And that certainly was very significant. Some of the challenges, let's talk for a few minutes about some of the challenges of exploring that idea of what it means to be Native, or what it means to live in a culture that often doesn't understand who Native Americans are. And let me use one statistic here. I'm a professor. Oh, and by the way, you can see behind me lots and lots of books. It really is part of my value of education today, and part of my challenge and encouragement to you to continue on with your education and to work hard and to value that, because it will open doors for you and give you opportunities as you grow and develop and live your life. But one of the things that I learned, or one of the challenges, is because I don't necessarily look Native. Oh, I was going to use the statistics, sorry. A survey was done 2 years ago in 2018 that asked Americans some of their viewpoints on Native Americans. And one of the answers and the results was astounding. It turned out that 40% of Americans did not think that Native Americans were a contemporary culture anymore. Their views on natives were stuck in history, stuck in the past. That Native Americans, yeah, they used to roam the Great Plains and ride on horses and shoot bows and arrows and live in teepees, but they have no connection to everyday modern life, which astounded me. 40% of Americans thought there was no such really thing as contemporary Native culture. And so oftentimes then when people find out I'm Native, they're in a sense taken aback. Like, wait a minute. You're Native and you're a professor? That doesn't connect with me. Because other statistics, other surveys show that Americans tend to get most of their understanding of who Indians are from the media. Just think about that for a minute. If about 90% of Americans get their understanding of who natives are from seeing them in movies and on television and so on, that tells you something there already. Because most of the times when natives appear in movies or on television, it's in that historical context of riding on horses across the Great Plains, living in teepees, shooting bows and arrows, and so on. Very rarely do movies and television portray Native Americans in a contemporary setting. And there's reasons for that, which I won't go into here. But if you are ever at Bethel and you take my class in Native Americans in the media, we certainly explore why it is that natives aren't often portrayed in a contemporary setting. And so that often means, in some senses, to people who find out I'm Native, I have to prove that I'm Native. And imagine that. Imagine being put in the position where you have to prove who you are. And that's unsettling. But I always say I have to respond to that with grace, in that these are people who, for the most part, haven't been exposed to Native culture, don't know anyone who's Native, and they're going to have misperceptions and stereotypes. And I recognize that and understand it. And I would rather work with them and help educate them as to who we are as a people, rather than get angry with them or mad with them or reject them because of that initial sort of stereotype. So I would encourage you as well to live with grace and to seek to educate and develop and restore relationships rather than reject relationships. And sometimes then, once people get to know who I am, I think that makes a difference, that I respond with grace to some of those initial stereotypes. And sometimes it comes up in other unexpected ways, having to prove who I am. For example, when I go into a bank, and if I want to make a large deposit or a large withdrawal, banks often require 2 pieces of identification. So I'll give them my driver's license, no problem, that works. But then I'll use my tribal ID as my second form of identification. And usually the teller will look at that and kind of try and figure out what is this and why is this a second piece of ID? And then I'll patiently explain to them that under Minnesota law, a tribal ID is considered just as valid an identification as a driver's license, and that under the law, they should accept that as a proper form of identification. But I have had several instances where the bank has refused to accept the tribal ID, and I've had to go through higher channels to get the bank to realize you're violating the law when you do that. That's a civil rights violation. And so I would also encourage you, don't be afraid at times to stand up for who you are, because we do need to be recognized as valid, as legitimate, as co-equals in terms of living in contemporary society. That we aren't just relegated to the historical past, and that we do have rights and so on. In Minnesota, it often comes up with some people get upset with how many fish Native Americans take out of Lake Mille Lacs, or hunting rights that Native Americans seem to have. Those are practices like gill net fishing. And most people simply don't understand those are rights that we still have under treaties, and that we are simply exercising the rights that we negotiated with state and federal governments, and that we don't have to shy away from those, or we don't have to hide those, that we can live proudly in terms of who we are. And I think it also means, in many respects, then that when I talk with students, because mostly I work with college students, and I realize some of you are, or all of you are younger than that at this particular point. But one of the things that often comes up is Bethel doesn't have a whole lot of Native students or students who identify as Native. Usually in any given year, it's maybe anywhere from 6 to 12. And I work with those students a lot and encourage them to explore their Native heritage more and so on. And oftentimes one of the things that they share with me is that they're kind of reluctant to share their heritage with their classmates and with fellow students and with the Bethel community. And that's because past experiences have told them that it sometimes is not well accepted. Now, I won't say that at Bethel. I don't want anyone to think that Bethel is a place that doesn't accept Native Americans. I've found it to be a very accepting place, a place where, like I said, Bethel has recognized and honored me for sharing my Native American heritage with the Bethel community. But because of past experiences, students tend to be a little bit hesitant to talk about it. And one of the things that I often work with Native students is to encourage them and help them to find ways to express and share their Native heritage with their friends and so on. And so I would encourage that with you. Don't be afraid to express who you are. There's nothing shameful about being Native. It is who we are. It's how we live. It is just as valid as anything else in terms of contemporary society. And we need to live it, and we need to share it because, as I've said, most people don't understand who we are in the first place. And I think that's going to be a larger and larger role for us in contemporary society, especially now in a time where racial diversity has become one of the hottest topics in the United States. Is we need to be proud of our Native heritages and share that and express it. My son, for example. Oh, and I should say this. Ever since I've been on this journey, it's harder for me to connect with my tribe because my tribe is in Michigan and I'm here in Minnesota. I go back as often as I can for powwows, and now through the internet I can connect with my tribe online to attend community meetings and things like that. My twin brother is very much involved with the tribe. He's a member of their Child Welfare Commission, and he's also involved as part of a group that oversees grants to help Native Americans establish small businesses in my tribe's area. And so I have had to work hard because I don't have a direct connection to my tribe on a regular basis. I've had to work hard to help. I have one son, and I've had to work hard to help him learn what it means to be Native. So I've had to make sure I pass on the stories to him. Unfortunately, I'm lousy with language. I don't learn language as well. So passing on the language is something that I really haven't been able to do. But I've been able to pass on some of the ceremonies and rituals and so on. So, for example, he has his tribal name, which I never did get from my father because of his running away from his heritage when I was young. But I wanted to make sure my son went through the naming ceremony. And he also helped me with the ceremony in creating my eagle staff, because after the eagle staff was created, what remained, what wasn't used as part of the staff, needed to be burned, and then the ashes spread through or spread across running water. My son participated in that ceremony with me. So that is actually the challenge in many ways, is how do those of us who didn't grow up on the reservation, didn't grow up learning the language and the ritual, as we have answered that question, what does it mean to be Native? and have become much more native in our practice and our outlook and so on. How do we pass that on to the next generation? And I will admit it is a challenge. But if you go around to just about any reservation in the United States and ask them, what is the biggest challenge your tribe faces, even though many tribes have high levels of poverty or high levels of addiction or physical diseases or things of that nature, you'll hear almost to a tribe, the biggest issue we face is how do we preserve our culture? How do we pass it on to the next generation when they don't live on the reservation, when they don't speak the language? And so getting or encouraging Native young people to come back or to connect with the tribe is a huge issue. My tribe does that often through the internet. Our tribal website, for example, has audio and video of tribal elders sharing some of our stories. You can get language lessons through the internet. So there are ways to connect, and I would encourage you, if your connection to your tribe hasn't been all that strong, or even if it's been non-existent, just finding your tribe on the internet might be one way that you can connect and start to dig a little bit deeper into that question of what does it mean to be native. And I think that has been the overall arching theme. Let me take a second here to look at my notes and see if there's anything else I missed in terms of talking about my story. And I hope it has been encouraging to realize that education, especially, I think that's one of my main things, that education can help you get ahead in life. And don't be afraid to seek out those resources and seek out help to find those resources. But just overall, I encourage you to go on that journey and explore the question, what does it mean to be native? It will change your life. It will change relationships. And I think it will actually build your self-esteem as you realize we have a lot to be proud of as a culture. You have a lot to be proud of as being connected to a tribe or being a member in a tribe. And those things are important. We need to know who we are. And especially we need to know who we are in relationship to our Creator. Because it was our Creator who gave us the land and the animals and fellow human beings. And we need to be in right relationship with our Creator. Otherwise, life gets a lot more difficult, especially in such trying times as these. And so I would also say that if any of you want to discuss further, I am more than happy to continue discussions with anyone. Whoever is showing you this video hopefully would have my contact information, and I'm more than happy to continue the dialogue and continue the conversation. So I'm just trying to think here. Last thing in my notes. Oh, and by the way, that is one thing that people have to get used to. I teach often from a Native American perspective, specifically, and that means that I don't always necessarily do things in a linear fashion. As Native Americans, we do tend to be storytellers and make connections that don't often seem like they're connections, but they ultimately make sense, and students sometimes have a hard time following that nonlinear sort of an approach, and that's part of the educationist process as well. I've had so many people over the years tell me, Scott, you just think differently. And I do. It's because I see the world through Native eyes, and I've also learned to see the world through Western culture eyes. And sometimes I combine them. Sometimes I see solely through Native eyes. Sometimes I see solely through Western eyes. And sometimes I have to figure out what viewpoint I'm using altogether. But I value that because the ability to see the world through the eyes of different cultures is a significant skill and a significant advantage in today's modern American society. And I can share one more challenge here before I close. Is a few years ago I was asked to write a book on Native Americans in the media, which I was excited to do, to actually write a book on to have a Native American author write a book on how Native Americans are portrayed in the media, which at that point really hadn't been done. Most of the people who looked at Native American portrayals were not Native. I worked with the editor, got all the way through writing the book and through the draft and a couple of rewrites, and the editor signed off on it. We were at the stage of getting endorsements and picking out a picture for the cover of the book. In fact, if you go online and use my name, Scott Sochay, Sochay, and maybe use words like Native Americans in the media, you will still find potentially pictures of the cover of that book. But the book unfortunately never got published because when my editor passed it on to her boss for final approval, her boss looked at it and said, students won't understand it because it's written from a Native American worldview and a Native American perspective. Here's all these changes I want to the book to make it more understandable to white American students. And the changes that the editor suggested would have completely ruined the nature of the book and the approach I took. And so as a result, the book never got published, and I still can't release it because they hold the rights to it under the contract. But that certainly was a challenge. Here I thought I was going to have an amazing opportunity to share a Native perspective on how Native Americans are portrayed in the media, and ultimately it did not come about because someone outside of Native culture didn't understand it. All right, so I think this is my third or fourth attempt at wrapping things up. I think I've said what I needed to say, which again is a Native way of viewing things. We're not so much tied to a specific time frame, but we'll speak as long as we need to say what we feel, what we need to say. And so I'll just end with Megwitch. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate your willingness to listen to some of my story. Really, when I think of taking care of myself right now, especially in some difficult times with COVID, and hopefully that won't be with us a whole lot longer, but to take care of myself really means taking care of the whole person. From a tribal perspective, we look at human beings as far more holistic than American culture does, which often tends to see us as just a material being with flesh and blood. And so to take care of myself is not just to take care of myself physically, but also mentally, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. And that to take care of myself is to take care of relationships, to make sure I am in right relationship with the world that the Creator has given us. Value your education. I hope the story you heard from me with my dad becoming the first member of our family to graduate from college, and how Native American scholarships and so on allowed me to continue on in my education. Education opens doors. It creates the potential for a better life, and then also the potential to give back in ways to your community, to your families, to your tribe, and for me to the Bethel community, to share my Native American heritage that way. So stay in school, work hard, dream big, and good things will happen.